Chapter 2, Lesson 1 of Geometry, finally moving out of Chapter 1, and we're going to begin with looking at some conditional statements, and this is where we're really going to develop the reasoning aspects of geometry, the logical thinking aspects of geometry, how we prove things. We're going to lay a few foundational things in logic, and then we want to look at being specific with our wording, and so that will be the focus of this chapter. We're going to look at conditional statements first, and then we'll look at converses. And no, we're not talking about the tennis shoes. We're talking about converses of conditional statements. So conditional statements, you've heard of them before. They're if-then statements. You've heard them from your parents. If you don't clean your room, then you can't go to the movie, or if you do your chores, then you get your allowance. So these are conditional statements. They're if-then statements is another phrase for them. And every conditional has two parts, and I want you to notice the word here, following. What follows the word if is the hypothesis, and what follows the word then is the conclusion. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Conditional statement then is an if-then statement. Anything that's in that form would be considered a conditional statement. The conditional statements contain hypothesis and conclusion, and an example here would be if you're not completely satisfied, then your money will be refunded. Now the hypothesis we talked about follows the word if. If is not part of the hypothesis, so I don't want you to include it in your answer. When I ask you to identify the hypothesis, if you include the word if, then I'm going to have to consider that you haven't been detailed or particular enough about what the definition is, because the word if is not part of it. So in our example, the hypothesis, you are not completely satisfied. The conclusion follows the word then, and again, then is not part of the conclusion. It's what follows the word then. So the words if and the words then really just give us a place where we can identify what the hypothesis and the conclusion are. We know what to look for, but once we've located them, the if and the then have done their job. They are no longer to be used as part of the hypothesis or part of the conclusion. So in our example, the conclusion would be what comes after the word then, which would be your money will be refunded. Mathematically speaking, this is the symbolic form here, P then Q, and we read it if P then Q. So this little word arrow, kind of takes the place of the word then. The letter P is used to mathematically symbolize the hypothesis, and the letter Q is the symbol to mathematically represent the conclusion. Now, why do we use P and Q? I have no idea. That might be a good thing to look up. So, for example, if I asked you, and this will be the types of problems you'll have on your homework, we'll give you a conditional statement, and we'll ask you to identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. So in this sentence, what's the hypothesis? Well, we find the word if. There it is. What comes after it? T minus 38 equals 3. So this is the hypothesis. Notice that after the hypothesis is a parentheses. No, that's not a parentheses. Is a comma. And then we see the word then. And again, what comes after the word then is the conclusion. So T is equal to 41 would be the conclusion. So in this example, here's the word if. So the hypothesis is an integer ends in 0. Here's the word then. The conclusion is the integer is divisible by 5. Another conditional statement. Here's the word if. What comes after it? An animal is a Cocker Spaniel. Here's the word then. So the animal is a dog would be the conclusion. So you get the idea. Now, one thing about this. Most of your examples will be given where if comes first and then comes second. But that's not always the case. In other words, there will be some cases where the animal is a dog if the animal is a Cocker Spaniel. So in that case, the if comes second. And so it really comes down to finding the word if, that, and then using that to determine where the hypothesis is, and then the beginning would be the conclusion. So don't be sucked into thinking that the hypothesis always comes first in a sentence, because there is a way to write it where the if comes second, and the hypothesis then is second in the sentence, because it still is the part that follows the word if no matter where that if occurs in the sentence. Okay, so those are some more examples. If you wanted to pause the video and take a stab at what those were, you can take a look at those. Now, one of the things that we're going to want you to be able to do is to take a sentence that's not a conditional and write it as a conditional. In other words, we have this statement here that a rectangle has 4 right angles. We can turn that into a conditional by writing the word if. Now, it's not as easy as just writing the word if in front of it. We have to determine what a rectangle is and add that into the sentence. So you'll notice we can't say if rectangle then has 4 right angles. Okay, if rectangle sounds a little, halting English, not something that we would say. So we need to add something in. So in this case we added if the figure is a rectangle, then it has 4 right angles. So you may need to add something in front here that describes what the item is in order to write it as an if-then statement. So here we have glass objects are fragile. So we would write them if the object is glass, then the object is fragile. Again, so we have to kind of add a few words in that help the sentence make sense. Good weather makes picnics enjoyable. So if the weather is good, then the picnic will be enjoyable. Okay, so we want to make sure that we're needing to add in any words that we need to in order to help the sentence make sense. Now, this becomes the very important part of the lesson. Talk about the types of words that we want you to use. And for me, I don't want you to use the following words for the fact that I want us to practice being very specific. I want us to practice communicating effectively and communicating in a way where we can't be misunderstood. And the way to do that is to use specific words, words that can't be misinterpreted. And there are a few words that we would, if we were to use them, leaves things open to being interpreted differently or putting in our own thoughts when someone really means something else. And it's simply because the words are a little vague and we don't want you to use those. So I want you to practice that. So I'm going to give you a couple words that I don't want you to use, and then these would be words that if you do use them, I'll mark you down, just because, again, I want you to learn to use specific words, not to use these types of words. And one of the words is the word it. And again, we don't want to use the word it, because if I said it is cold, what am I talking about? Could be the weather is cold, could be my sandwich in the refrigerator is cold, could be the ice cream is cold, could be the dog is cold, it could be my feet are cold, it could be just about anything when you use the word it. So this is a very non-specific word, and it's not a word we want to use academically. So I don't want you to use the word it, and I don't want you to use the word they. They also again leaves things open. They are warm. Again, what am I talking about? Am I talking about my feet, my hands, a group of people, or what? So we don't want you to use these words that are not specific. And the way to put in there what I want you to put in there is simply to put in the place of the word it, put what it is you're thinking about. When you say it is cold, what are you thinking about when you say that? My feet. Oh, I'll just say, well, my feet are cold, or whatever it may be. So for example, if two lines are perpendicular, then they intersect to form right angles. Now this would be okay writing because the sentence tells us what they are, but again, I want you to practice not using these words. So instead of using the word they, what would you put here? Well, again, what are you thinking about when you say this word? Well, we're thinking about these two lines. So if the two lines are perpendicular, then the two lines intersect to form right angles. So we would just go ahead and use the word or the phrase the two lines rather than using the word they. Here, if two angles are congruent, then they have the same measure. Well, what are we thinking about when we say they? Well, we go back to the subject. It's the two angles that have the same measure. So again, instead of using they, use the two angles, or use the phrase the two angles. All right. If an animal is a Cocker Spaniel, then it is a dog. What are you thinking about when you're saying the word it? Well, you're going back to the subject, if the animal. So again, instead of using the word it, then use the phrase the animal. All right, so work on being specific, work on not using those words, and we'll go on to the next part in the next video talking about truth value.